It's a historic moment.
What's his name? George Floyd!
Protests that have quickly grown into a global outcry for an end to racism.
The frustration and the rage, it's a past due notice on the debts owed to black communities for the last 400 years.
Who's holding the weapons?
That demand for change has found immediate form in the cause that sparked the fire. More than 1,000 people are killed by police in America every year. It is now the 6th leading cause of death for young black men. No other organisation in America is allowed to act so ruthlessly with such impunity. But given this unprecedented opportunity for change, how can the police be forced to truly protect and serve?
I'm sick and tired of it! Every single day! Ladies and gentlemen, you have to back up. Everybody has to back up.
America's police are heavily armed. Almost every officer is entitled to carry a semi-automatic pistol. What's more, the Department of Defense transfers surplus weapons to local police forces.
The police force in charge of providing security in Los Angeles' schools was given 3 grenade launchers. Eventually they returned it, but they did keep 61 automatic rifles and a mine-resistant vehicle. This has ensured that the police are not just heavily armed, but they increasingly have come to look more like a military force than like peace officers.
You will be arrested or subject to other police actions.
Little wonder that police in America have become a deadly force. Almost 8,000 people were killed by police between 2013 and 2019. Black people, who make up 13% of America's population, account for 25% of those deaths. They are almost 3 times more likely than white people to be killed by police. Dr. Philip Atiba-Goff is head of the Centre for Policing Equity, which analyses data to try to understand these racial disparities.
What all that research clearly says is that crime and poverty are not sufficient explanations for racial disparities in stops and in use of force. So the real question is, what's the rest? Some of that are the policies and the culture and the behavior of law enforcement.
The call for reform is one that has become deafening in recent weeks, but it's not an easy task. For a start, there are about 18,000 different law enforcement agencies, from federal agencies to state, city, county, and even school police. Almost half of them employ fewer than 10 officers.
And so when you talk about police reform, what you're talking about is trying to get 18,000 different entities to change their behavior. That's incredibly complex and difficult to do.
Law enforcement agencies, for the most part, regulate themselves. Take, for example, rules around their use of force. Federal law states this must be objectively reasonable. But there's no single rule establishing clearly what this means in practice.
Hands behind your back, sir.
Some states and cities have passed their own laws on the subject, but not many. So in most cases, it's left to each police agency to create and enforce its own use of force policies, if they choose to address it at all. The police are also protected by strong unions, which tend to oppose reforms.
So police unions can be incredibly powerful. Their job is essentially to protect the rank and file from litigation, from injury. But sometimes what is in the best interest of individual officers isn't what's in the best interest of public safety.
Police unions are very good at negotiating favorable contracts for their members, but those contracts often include protections from discipline, which can make it really, really difficult for police chiefs to get rid of people who they know are bad apples.
This is how many people were killed by a police officer between 2013 and 2019. And these are how many officers were charged and convicted. The disparity is in part because prosecutors are reluctant to bring charges against police officers. Prosecutors need to win convictions to advance their careers. To convict people, they need police to testify. And police won't help prosecutors who go after cops. All of which might help to explain the sense of impunity sometimes displayed by officers, not least the one responsible for the death of George Floyd.
One of the people I talked to over the course of my reporting was a sociologist named Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve. She works on prosecutorial police relationships, and she made an observation that I found very hard to shake. And that was that during that video, you see Officer Chauvin looking directly into the camera as he presses his knee into Mr. Floyd's neck. He knows he's being filmed, yet he stares directly into one of the cameras.
He's not even resisting arrest right now, bro.
His nose is bleeding.
Professor Gonzalez Van Cleve observed that that would not happen if he thought he would be prosecuted. To her mind, and to mine too, that was just evidence that he knew that nothing was going to happen from what he was doing.
Officers are also protected from civil prosecution. Under the principle of qualified immunity, lawsuits against them can only proceed if there is clear legal precedent that what the officer was doing was wrong.
It's a preposterous bar to hold somebody to account only when someone has done that specific thing before. And so what you'll hear is most reformers say qualified immunity has to go because even the egregiously bad incidents often get off the hook because no one ever thought to be that egregious previously.
With the obstacles to change seemingly so entrenched, perhaps it's little wonder there's been a rallying cry for more extreme action.
There's a new call for deep structural reform of policing across the country.
Asking city leaders to defund police departments.
One of the most important things right now is to understand what people mean when they say defund the police. There are some people who, by saying defund the police, literally mean abolish law enforcement. The community can take care of violence. That's not the thing that I hear most commonly, particularly from black neighborhoods. What I hear from them is that the purpose of defunding is to shift resources from punishment to empowerment so that they have the ability to live lives where you don't have to call the police. You would never send a nurse to break up a drug narcotics ring. Why on earth are you sending law enforcement to go deal with someone who's overdosing?
It's a seductive yet politically divisive idea. But for some forces, defunding isn't enough. The only solution, to start again from scratch. For years, Camden, New Jersey, was among America's most violent cities. In 2012, it had the 5th highest murder rate in the country. That same year, it disbanded its police.
They shut down the police force, they hired people back, they ended up expanding the force. But when they reconstituted their force, they really paid a lot of attention to best practices, to improving community relations. They wrote a use of force policy that's 18 pages long, extremely detailed, one of the best, most detailed use of force policies in America.
It seems to have worked. Camden says the number of complaints about excessive force has declined every year. In 2014, there were 65. Last year, there were 3. Only political will can determine whether Camden's example is enough to help overcome resistance to reform elsewhere. There are cities, from New York to Los Angeles, that are already contemplating similarly bold action.
In the city where George Floyd was killed, the Minneapolis City Council promised last night to dismantle the police department.
The Democrats in Congress have proposed a bill of sweeping reforms, which would make it easier to punish police misconduct and restrict the use of deadly force.
As Americans from across the country peacefully protest to demand an end to injustice.
But the White House is sending a very different message.
Donald Trump's approach to policing has always been the police should do whatever they want and they should be as tough as they can because they're the good guys. So my concern with Donald Trump's behavior is that he has essentially taken the federal government out of the conversation about policing, and he has forced states and localities to take the mantle on themselves.
Those calling for change today can demand action through the ballot box in November.
I really do believe that we collectively are going to make a choice, a series of choices, and we're going to get to decide. The future that's in front of us on reforms in public safety and the future that's in front of us in terms of how we're going to treat some of our most oppressed and most abused citizens, it's not something that's going to happen to us. It's something we're going to choose.
Who they choose, from city council all the way to the White House, could prove decisive in the challenge of turning indignation into legislation and enduring social change.
I'm John Fassman, the Economist Washington correspondent. To see more of our coverage of racial injustice in America and across the world, click the link opposite. Thank you for watching.